Okay, now you know. All right, hello and welcome one more time. This is Visions of Mutual Power, part of the Building Laterally event series hosted by the Digital Infrastructure Incubator at Code for Science and Society. I am Raya El Zain. I'm a white woman with short curly hair. I'm wearing a floral print, and my moving image is beaming into your office or your car or your corner bodega or wherever you are from Philadelphia, which is Lenape territory. Thanks for being here. Closed captioning is enabled for this event. You can turn on the live transcript by pressing the CC button in the bottom of the Zoom window. A reminder to all our speakers and question askers that this works best when we speak slowly. I will just walk us through the general structure of this call and the tools we're using. You'll notice we're in a regular Zoom meeting. Thank you for helping me demonstrate that. You can do what's comfortable with your camera, but please do try and keep muted until we're in the Q&A portion. The other tool we're using together is a Google Doc, which has been linked in the chat. Maybe we get it bumped one more time. Thanks so much. We invite all participants to add their names and affiliation to the roll call on page 4 or 5, I think, of this doc. This is a way of meeting and greeting each other in the absence of being in physical space together. If you have announcements or resources you'd like to share, feel free to include those as well. The doc also hosts our agenda for today. You'll see a general kind of layout, speaker bios, and then some support for the Q&A portion towards the end. At any time during this event, you can type a question into the Google Doc, into that Q&A section, or into the Zoom chat. We will collect and hold them for the Q&A. If you would like to speak during the Q&A, you can type the word stack into the Zoom chat, or you can raise your hand. I'll repeat these options again when we get closer to that portion. We'll also collect resources shared today in the doc. It'll stay open for 24 hours and then we'll close it, and you can find it on the incubator website. Finally, a code of conduct guides our engagement here. It's linked in that Google Doc, replete with how to make a report. At CS&S, we strive to create safe, inclusive spaces where people can learn from each other. We are committed to providing a harassment-free environment where everyone, regardless of gender, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, ability, physical appearance, body size, race, age, religion, or work experience. We try to understand the difference between intent and impact, and our code of conduct is guided by those commitments. If you tend to speak less, go ahead and take space. If you tend to speak more, make space. At the end of the event, we'll ask you for your feedback in a quick survey. Moni, if you would go ahead and drop that link now, and we'll do it again at the end. But I'm hoping if we drop it now, it gets it on your radar. Please do fill it out. Your feedback helps us secure the funding to continue to do work like this and host the guests, the great guests that we have today. Okay, I think that's all in terms of logistics. Did I miss anything, Moni, Danielle? Okay, then with pleasure, I'd like to introduce Danielle Robinson, the Executive Director of Code for Science and Society.
Hi, folks. I am thrilled to be here today. And can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, got some thumbs up. So I'm going to do a slide deck because this is my first day of childcare after a 10-day childcare outage. And so my brain is in an interesting place. And I figured if I didn't do slides, I would forget to say important things. So I'm Danielle. I'm the Executive Director of Code for Science and Society. I am a cis white woman with longer hair in my 40s, sitting in my house in the rainy, dark and rainy Pacific Northwest. So when it's 46 here, it's not balmy. When it's 46 here, it is cold and wet. And so my goal here is to tell you a little bit about Code for Science and Society and why we're doing this, and then to get out of the way and support the conversation. So Code for Science and Society was founded in 2016 with a mission to advance the power of data to improve the social and economic lives of all people. You've been in the world with me since 2016, and a lot has changed around the way that we see data and tech. And so what does that mean today to advance the power of data to actually improve lives and not just track us around the internet selling us shoes? We have a vision. We take a community-centric approach. We imagine a future where communities build research and build data and build technology initiatives that grow global access to knowledge in order to shift power to communities that have been harmed, omitted, and excluded. There's no future or tool or software or app that's going to change the world in a positive way, but when communities use technology for meaningful empowerment, that does have a chance. So that's what we work towards. And we do that through funding and resources. We work across open source software, open data, and initiatives that put access to knowledge. We provide funding and resources for emerging communities. We provide spaces for research and practice, such as this. And we provide practical and strategic support through something called fiscal sponsorship. And today, you know, why this, why now? We built the digital infrastructure to bridge research and theory on open source and digital infrastructure with the practice and implementation. So what happens when you get people involved and how do things play out in reality? And part of this work is to create open spaces for thoughtful engagement and resources for practical engagement. And that's why I am just unbelievably honored to have the time and attention of our guests today. Labor, power, and governance are key conceptions. That's not the word I meant to write there, but they're key concepts and or are key to conceptions of infrastructure. And when we ignore those things, we fall into old traps. And I'm excited to discuss with you all some ideas intersecting with equity, white supremacy, labor and power, and how these things are shaping our ecosystem and where we might go as a community. So with that, I will stop talking and hand it over to Rhea.
Thank you, Danielle. As she mentioned, and I said before, I'm Rhea. I'm here as the program manager for the Digital Infrastructure Incubator, one of the programs that Code for Science and Society runs. The incubator is a new capacity building program for open source digital public infrastructure projects. And as part of that program, we've put together this public event series that's designed to connect conversations about sustainability, governance, and community health in open source to larger political debates. This is the third event of 5 in that series. We started with a discussion about labor across the tech landscape. Our second event was about the proliferation of anti-oppression frameworks in open source. And recordings for those 2 events are up on that website and on the event series link that Moni just pushed in the chat. Our next event, coming up on February 23rd, explores the coloniality of digital infrastructure, and we'll have a lot more exciting announcements about the speakers for that event coming up. You can register for it at this link. Thank you, Moni. All right, today's event, Visions of Mutual Power. This conversation responds in part to growing enthusiasm, felt urgency, and even anxiety about governance in open source and digital public infrastructure. As you know, at Code for Science and Society, we don't build technology or steward data ourselves. Our work consists of strategizing with, building resources for, and producing analysis for and about the teams building open technology and stewarding open data. In our work, we're hearing patterns and rhythms in the ways in which project leaders are called into the practice of building governance, how they're feeling out different models, how they're working to implement them. Notably, for this event, that work of building transparent governance is often perceived as separate or detached from the visions driving an open source or digital public infrastructure project. And by this, I mean that there's often a specific problem open source and open data projects are working to address, a societal problem, but the way that decisions get made among developers, how we look for and secure funding, and other considerations directly related to the sustainability of these projects is often seen as detached from or somehow separate from that larger social landscape in which the projects intervene. The result is perhaps that project governance can feel like a chore, and documentation can feel like a chore. And all the ways that we build out transparency about how decisions get made can feel like a chore and a distraction from the real work of building the tool that is working to transform space, improve access, and otherwise correct imbalances. So one goal for today's event was to invite us to step back from the nitty-gritty and take in a bigger picture around how power is incrementally built. Our panelists are organizers, technologists, and movement makers interested in the power of open technology, who have experimented with different models of catalyzing change, building leadership, skill sharing, collective action, democratic representation, and other ways of organizing workers, neighbors, and volunteers into formations poised to transform homes, neighborhoods, communities, and society. Okay, so without any further ado, let's get into it. I've asked the speakers to introduce themselves today, orienting us towards what they do and how they came to do it. And following this, I've prepared a set of 5 questions that we'll put to all of them, and then we'll move into a Q&A portion. Sound okay? All right. I'm wondering if Camille Acey, would you start us off?
Oh, can you hear me all right?
I sure can.
Great. My name is Camille Acey. I have a brown face, near shoulder length black hair. I'm wearing a black long sleeve top, and I have round gray and gold earrings. I am seated in front of a wooden bookshelf, and I'm joining from Crown Heights in Brooklyn, New York City, United States, I guess unceded Lenape-Hoking territory. I am a founding member of the Collective for Liberation, Ecology, and Technology. We are a woman-run collective focused on promoting open source tools for the solidarity economy. That effort grew out of extensive, near 20-year engagement with housing and food cooperatives and other sorts of cooperatives that me and my co-founders were involved with. And I guess our dissatisfaction with cooperatives and the solidarity economy. There's a lot of unmuted people, I think, here. So I try not to be distracted. In addition to being a founding member of Colette, I'm on the advisory board for the Maintainers, which is a global sort of research network and I guess a community also of practice that's shining a light on the ways and the people that maintain our built up infrastructure and digital infrastructure. I'm also on the board, I'm the chairwoman, actually on the board now of Whose Knowledge, which is a global campaign that is centering the knowledge and work of Indigenous communities and other sorts of communities around the world, marginalized people around the world. So that's a majority of what I do. And I think a lot of the things I've been involved with have been really about either building groups or working with groups that want to raise marginalized voices, that want to think about ways we can work together and be together in various formations in a way that's more liberatory and transformative. And I think that's all I'll share about myself for now. I'll dig in a little bit more as we move along. Thanks so much for having me.
Perfect, Camille. Thank you so much. Liz Berry, would you introduce yourself next?
Hi, Rhea, thanks. It's an honor to be here, also to see everyone who's tuning in today and also be with my co-panelists and the organizers. So my name is Liz Berry. I'm calling in from Los Angeles, United States. My visual description is a white cis woman, 40s, wearing a fluorescent yellow and pink sweater in front of an iridescent curtain. I have brown curly hair and glasses. There was a prompt that asked, how do you work? And I am drawn to small groups of people with vision primarily in the environment or democracy sectors. And then I typically join projects as co-founder and specialize in enabling many, many more people to work together on cross-domain issues. So I'm a serial social entrepreneur and prolific collaborator. Any examples I share today can be assumed to involve many, many, many others. Some of the problem spaces I've engaged with are the lack of environmental information at meaningful scales for personal and public health, and for successful advocacy around health. So this is when you're trying to stand for what you stand on, and you're faced with the gatekeeping of expertism and professionalism, which interferes with multiple ways of knowing. I also engage with the problem space around scaling deliberation for quality decision-making. This is the too many evenings problem and the polarization and gridlock problem of political parties. And for me, these two problem spaces converge right in governance, and that at a basic level, democracy needs knowledge to function. So I'll list a couple of my collaborative projects: the Public Laboratory for Open Technology and Science, Tree Kit, where thousands of New Yorkers hugged every single tree on the sidewalk of New York and created the highest quality spatial inventory ever. I also was a bit obsessed earlier in life with sitting next to a sign that said, "Talk to me," and meeting strangers, getting strangers to meet each other, throwing parties outside where people could self-organize around questions. And that kind of talk of the town carried through into how I was active in Occupy, where in Taiwan, like a non-stateside Occupy location, the demonstrations of massive deliberation at scale won major concessions from the government and kind of started me working on crowd law and shifting away from elected representative politics and towards civic lotteries. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And finally, Njera Keith, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name is Njera Keith. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a beautiful Black woman with nappy hair and a peach fuzzed face. I'm wearing a teal turtleneck, a teal beret, and gold earrings. In 2016, I founded a grassroots organization in Austin called Black Sovereign Nation. The organization worked to build political, cultural, and economic autonomy among Black families in East Austin. In 2018, I co-founded 401 with my partner, Christina. 401 is a cooperative federation that consists of a Black vanguard, which is itself a cooperative of collectives, Indigenous and people of color-led worker cooperatives, and an organization for white people interested in divesting from white supremacy and developing a nationalist identity that is rooted in solidarity with Black revolutionaries. I am interested in building authentic power among people who have been subjected to colonization, particularly Black people. I hold and always have held a Black first politic that is built on the idea that equity demands that we work to free people progressively from most marginalized to least marginalized on the scale of marginalization. I've been committed to the idea for most of my tenure as an organizer and revolutionary that self-determination and autonomy are key in preserving the dignity and resourcing the freedom of Black people. I've always believed in the development of alternatives such as solidarity economy, community schooling, and restorative justice. I believe vanguardism, which I'm deeply committed to, and do-ocracy to be compatible frameworks because each places the burden of work on those who are privileged enough to possess the capacity to take it on. I believe that these frameworks also share similar limitations. They have the potential to exclude, neglect, and ignore those who do not hold those same privileges. Proponents of such frameworks should make it their business to leverage their orientations to grow the capacity of those least privileged and not to build a world that centers their vision alone. The success of a movement should be measured by the transformation of the dynamics that exist between those who are empowered and those who are disempowered. In short, do-ocracies and vanguards should exist to make themselves obsolete. The commitment to that aim should be tangibly demonstrated in everyday engagement. For example, 401 leverages vanguardism, allyship, and BIPOC solidarity to make ready-made communes available to the Black masses, an effort that we hope will ensure the rehabilitation of Black capacity and ultimately render Black liberation a directly democratic experience. The goal is to pass the baton, not to engage in saviorism. 401 was founded as a sustainability project for Black liberation movements. Our vision was to unionize the many factions of Black revolution by developing an ecological interdependence among movement workers, employing different tactics. Our hope was that the cohesion we developed would help us overcome the deprivation, isolation, infiltration, co-optation, and surveillance leveraged against Black radical organizations. We wanted to prove that the complete and total transformation of our society was, in fact, a realistic objective, and that through the gradual cultivation of real human and economic power, we could manifest a more holistic and sustainable human experience. During my time with Black Sovereign Nation, I discovered the limitations of survival programs and mutual aid among poor and working class Black people. BSN housed a full-time K through 12th grade community school, housing cooperative, dozens of community gardens, and a few other grassroots initiatives. The success of these efforts often depended on reciprocity among people who are culturally repressed, economically under-resourced, violently over-policed, and politically underdeveloped. I found the expectation of reciprocity under these conditions to be both unrealistic and unfair. And the feedback that I often received from other organizers was that our efforts felt unsustainable, as many of us were struggling to pay rent, feed ourselves, access healthcare. Later with 401 and through central planning, I was able to fund a basic income program, redistribute reparations, open another housing cooperative, subsidize food, and offer customized education to aspiring Black revolutionaries who committed to leveraging their capacity to making revolution a more accessible movement to the Black masses. And these are the efforts I remain committed to today.
Thank you so much, Njera. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Camille. I'm really excited to have you all here and to dig into these questions a little deeper. So I have 5 questions prepared for the panelists to consider, and that should keep us busy for 45, 50 minutes or so, and then we'll move on to a Q&A. What I hoped would be useful as a start was to explore 2 models of collective organizing, the notion of the do-ocracy and the notion of mutual aid. These are ideas and formations that we're hearing more and more about, that are getting more and more attention lately, I think, and which we can locate on opposite ends of a political spectrum. And I hope we can use this base to explore what it means to organize our projects in our communities. All right, question 1. Many open source projects are governed or identify as do-ocracies, an informal structure where the people who do the work make the decisions about where the project goes and what it prioritizes. For many, this promise of delegating decisions to those carrying out the work seems to have a liberatory potential. No overhead, no corporate interests, no bureaucracy. We make it, we decide where it goes. And this can seem like common sense, it's logical, it's efficient. Yet, as we see more and more, do-ocracies can also model and reflect the exclusions that already exist in a society. The same people disenfranchised elsewhere also find it difficult to volunteer time, to work for free, and so on, making the open source movement reflective of the more privileged parts of our society. These limitations really draw attention to the deep libertarian bias that's thread through the history of open source. I'd like to ask our panel, what does do-ocracy mean to you? Can you give examples of how you've seen it work or not work in open source or in other sectors that you've been in? Where and how have you seen it change over time? What is do-ocracy often confused with? What is it good at? Where does it fail? This is our question that's getting at the concept of do-ocracy. I wonder if Liz, would you kick us off for this one?
I'll give it a shot. Thank you. Yeah, my experience of living in a do-ocracy is that while it's freeing, or can be freeing, that no one says no to anyone, the flip side is that in a do-ocracy, we may not know how to say yes together. And so being in a state of free association, people are giving whatever gifts they want to give, but moving towards holding power together, which we feel like often should be the next step. Like, hey, something's going well, let's get more organized. Actually, ironically, it ends up shutting down the permissionless atmosphere, blocking maybe some of the flow that people may have been experiencing. I really experienced moments of trying to hold power together. I accidentally won an election last year in the global open source community for the gathering of open science hardware. And yeah, that open source community attempted to create an empowered group, an elected group, ran right into all the issues around representation. Who are we representing? There's a much smaller group of people now that's empowered. What domains are we deciding on? How are we in charge of coordinating, judging? It's been fascinating. And I also compare all of this to the experience of being in a social movement, where the feeling of stronger together is often developed through like building consensus and amplifying shared messaging across many voices together to exert greater power together over an institution, over a system, over a culture. At the same time, there may not necessarily be enough room or space to handle the amount of divergence that a do-ocracy can handle, when one person being, doing their own thing is okay in a spacious atmosphere. So I'm very interested to hear what the other panelists might say about that, and also share one example. And I am watching my time, Rhea. I want to offer that the public lab here might be an example. This is a global open source community, but it's backed by a nonprofit. And what the staff and the nonprofit do is we focus on facilitation, which I've suggested elsewhere as part of the Fearless Cities movement, the municipalist movement. That facilitation is broadly necessary as a civic infrastructure. And in the context of a do-ocracy, facilitation preserves that space for technical contributors to give the gifts and pursue the paths they want to, without a lot of guidance, while focusing what's up by listening and amplifying the voices and problem statements from frontline environmental justice researchers, and then pulling out of that do-ocracy pool what technologies have the best suited trajectories to advance local research, local advocacy, to make an impact on local environmental health, meeting the goals that are set by local leadership. So a facilitation and matchmaking function held by a mission-driven nonprofit that backs a global open source do-ocracy is an example I'd like to share here. Thank you.
This is Ray again. Thank you, Liz. That's great. That's great. Camille, what is do-ocracy to you? What's it been good at, and what's it not so good at?
Yeah, couple of things. I think back to one of my experiences in the co-ops. We started a food co-op across the street from my house. And I think something is lost when people sort of instinctively fall back because they knew one person is doing the lion's share of the work. In our case, we had a founder who she's just super committed across the community. She started the local CSA. She started a lot of efforts here. And when she does the most of the work, then people feel not entitled to their seats anymore. And it wasn't explicit that she never once, as far as I recall, said, I do most of the work, I get most of the say. But I think there's an instinctual thing or something that makes people say, well, I won't put this out there because I don't know if I can carry it all the way across. And I think Njera made some great points as regards to, you know, if some people have the capacity to do the most, does that mean they are entitled to make the decision for the majority of the people? And I really don't think that that's the case. And something is definitely lost, especially in these spaces where we get to start experimenting with other ways of working together can look like, for people to then allow someone consciously or unconsciously to dominate the space in that way. Something's really lost, because it is, I mean, for all the fact that we had money involved with the co-op, it was also sort of a play space and an imaginative space. And when people come in with that kind of dominance, something is lost. And it may be a matter of privilege. Like, this person had childcare and they had other concerns covered and they worked for themselves. So they had the ability to give that amount of time. And I don't think people should be punished for having, you know, basic concerns of taking care of their children, feeding themselves and things like that. I don't think their voice and seat at the table should be taken away because other people have the privilege to be able to step up. I also think, you know, one of the things that inspires the work we do at Colette are some of the lessons learned by some of my co-founders in Occupy. I think there was a situation where in some cases people were leaning very heavily on consensus decision-making models, where certain people who had not been doers would show up and be able to block decisions. I think that also isn't particularly fair. And I think, as much as it's not like a popular sort of phrasing in this way, but like, you know, there is something about like good fences make good neighbors and understanding boundaries, I think, and saying, this is the group, this is this decision-making body. And if you want to be part of this decision-making body, here's whatever commitment you need to make. That's something we have in Colette, and why we've only stayed 3 people is we made it pretty clear. We actually have it 9 months, which is the time it takes to gestate a baby, is 9 months of time you'd have to spend and invest into our organization to be sort of birthed into our collective. And we haven't found anyone who's been willing to make that commitment up till now. But I think it makes a good sense in, who's out. We've also had a concept of like people that are orbiting us and will join us for book groups and other things, but they're not part of the core group and they're not part of the decision-making group. And we codified that when we incorporated as a business, that this is the in group, this is the out group. Here's how you get out of the in group. Here's how you get into the in group. And I think that's really important. And, you know, within the work that we do, the other 2 members of the collective do more of the technical work. They both are self-employed, and we do a lot of work for, you know, worker-run cooperatives, other nonprofits. And I have a day job. I work in normal vanilla corporate tech, and I don't have time. So when they're making decisions around those projects and how that moves forward, they are fully empowered. I'm not a blocking member there. When it comes to our overall organization, then we know there's 3 voices in the room. So I think it does become a question of scale. It becomes a question of defining boundaries at any given time, so that when everybody's voice is needed or welcomed, that people know. And when it's a matter of a discrete group where, hey, we're doing the work, we can decide that that's pretty explicit.
This is Ray again. Thank you, Camille. I really love that idea of orbiting, right? As a way of saying you're attached, but not kind of within another structure. Thank you. Njera, you started off with your introduction talking a little bit about what do-ocracy is to you, but I wonder if you'd like to continue. What is a do-ocracy? What is it often confused with? What's it good at? Where does it fail?
Yeah, so I think that I'm observing recently a conflation made between mutual aid and do-ocracy. Mutual aid is a framework that relies on strong relationships, reciprocity, and collective determination. I believe it's supported by like a no person left behind principle that asks movements to progress at the speed of community capacity. Alternatively, I think do-ocracies have the potential to accelerate community capacity, but only if turned toward that aim, as opposed to advancing the interests of those doing the work. So this would require deep accountability to multiply marginalized communities and or revolutionary communities already building the infrastructure for their own liberation.
Thanks, Njera. I love that, progressing at the speed of community capacity. I've made a note there. I want to see what that looks like in different places. Great, thanks to the three of you. The next question moves us to kind of seeing if we can define, and picking up a little bit from what Njera just said about conflation between do-ocracy and mutual aid, to see if we can talk about what mutual aid is and how that's appearing in this space and across society. Over the past few years, since the murder of George Floyd, and then as the pandemic deepened, we've seen a big boom, I think, of activity that is, or that calls itself mutual aid, organizing the efforts of people providing for each other and the communities in the absence and the failure of services that have traditionally been provided by the state. Mutual aid, as the phrase suggests, refers to the reciprocal exchange of resources for mutual benefit, people giving what they can and getting what they need. So similar to I'd like to ask our panel, what does mutual aid mean to you? How has it appeared, or how has it been manifest in your work in open source or in other sectors? How have you seen it change over time? What's it confused with? What's it good at? Where does it fall short? I wonder if, Camille, would you start us off for this question?
Yeah, sure. And I'm glad it was mentioned, this conflation between do-ocracy and mutual aid. I do think they're kind of two vectors. I don't know that they necessarily overlap. Yeah, you know, I think mutual aid is really, in my mind, it's thinking about it, taking that step back from an anarchist perspective, is really exploring this idea that there's a way that we can be together in a sort of collaborative and cooperative way, with each like sort of contributing what they're capable of contributing, and people also not taking more than they need to. So moving sort of lightly in a space, and just a general sharing. I did find last year, with this explosion of mutual aid, you know, the same sort of problem that I struggled with cooperation and the cooperative movement, which is that if it's not in support of a larger political program, it just became charity. It simply became charity. And there's a wonderful group that does work around this. I'm forgetting their name now, but they do this mutual aid work, and they do a wonderful training around it. And they say solidarity, not charity. And I think it's really important. A really important concept is like, we're working together. And I think there was a troubling, at least here in New York City, and I can speak for New York City, class dynamic, where a lot of people came in with a lot of assumptions about what they thought other people needed. And mutual, I think core to mutual aid is a community of mutuals. One of the groups that I'm involved with is Praxis. The website's praxis.nyc. And we have a reading group, and some of the work we're doing is also in the spirit of developing political praxis. And we explored a way of building a community of mutuals, really. And we created sort of a loose checklist where we said, every day checking in, is everybody in your house warm enough? Is everybody in your house have enough food? Is anybody in your house ill? Like a quick checklist. And it was like something we played around with for a few weeks to see how it would go at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think that is what's key, and what's not as exciting for people. You know, I think people want to feel like they're scooping food into a baby's mouth or something like that. And I think it's not as exciting to be like, are your immediately surroundings okay? You know, one of the things I initiated even before the pandemic was just connecting my neighbors to each other, letting us understand. I live in a 6-story building in Brooklyn. We have a range of incomes, a range of races and ages, all sorts of things. And I was like, let's just know each other. Let's just know each other. And some of the things that are emerged are so interesting. Like one of it's just like keeping an eye out for whose packages arrived in the lobby, things like that, you know, but sometimes it becomes more serious. So creating those connections is not as exciting as the Black Lives Matter or whatever, you know, protests, but those day-to-day touches, like with neighbors who were like, I have this problem, I need this thing, I have this food, you know, can I share it with somebody? Somebody gifted me something I can't eat, does anybody need it? That kind of thing. You know, I think there's exciting potential in it. It's not the revolution, but there's a lot of exciting potential in there. And I think that's what it is. And I come to the work that I do today, partly by way of Murray Bookchin, who was an anarchist, and then, you know, unto a libertarian, socialist, municipalist thinker. And I think there's so much in the power of place and just saying, I'm here with these people in this place, and a lot of factors came into why we're here together, but this is my place where I'm going to organize from, as opposed to somewhere in the great beyond. So I think those are my thoughts really around mutual aid, or really if it needs to be about mutuality first, and not aid leading first, because I think those the power dynamics inherent in aid leading with aid, and I feel capable of aiding, or I'm doing it because I feel guilty or something like that. It's rotten from the core already at the beginning.
That's great, Camille. This is Ray again. That's great, Camille. Thank you. I really love thinking about politics as everyday touches, and then hold on to that. Liz, would you go next? What is mutual aid to you? Where have you seen it? Where does it good at? Where does it fail at?
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to attempt to dovetail right in with what Camille said about the everydayness, and also attempt to also build on what Njera articulated about mutual aid is based on relationship. So in a frame where we're all relevant to each other, you know, that the relevance of us being in relationship is essential to us finding our way together through the political gridlock and collapsing systems that are interfering with our ability to determine our own fate together. And this injustice of being unable to determine our own fate has brought my attention to how regular people can make decisions together. And I have a particular bone to pick with elected representatives and electoral democracy, representative democracy. It is too, it is an invalid way of reducing the high dimensionality of our lives together. And I want to bring up a point that it feels like mutual aid to me. It feels like mutual aid that we would all, that as regular people living our lives, that we would all take a shift and being selected to have into a policy council to explore some kind of a gridlocked issue, something where not enough perspectives have been heard before, not enough of the history has been heard before to get to a workable solution. And so, yeah, this is an incomplete thought around a politics where mutual aid would also involve us in relationship, hearing what each other's lives are really like and bringing that valuable knowledge to making the kind of political decisions that could get us into another place. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. Yes, yes. Njera, what is, you've said a little bit about this. What is mutual aid to you? How have you seen it used or misused in your work?
So I agree with so much of what Camille said. In my experience, charity is often conflated with mutual aid. I definitely agree that after the uprisings of 2020, we kind of saw mutual aid attract a great deal of interest, and those efforts sometimes devolved into charity and charitable endeavors. I think that when folks are from outside directly impacted communities and distributing aid and calling it mutual aid, that's what's happening. They're actually engaging in charity, and they are also sometimes engaging in saviorism, which is what I feel Camille pointed out. I think mutual aid is inherently reciprocal, and I think that charity creates a dependency from multiply marginalized communities on the benevolence of the privileged, which I don't think is okay. Mutual aid has the potential to establish autonomy in localized ecologies, while charity doesn't. I believe that where mutual aid falls short is scalability. In my opinion, a hyper focus on local struggle risks the perpetuation of inequity. So resources are not concentrated equitably across our planet. So while empowering people to make do with what they have where they are is conducive to autonomy and amazing, it does not ensure equity, and it makes space for the isolation and underdevelopment of communities that I think we've seen even internationally when we look at examples of people trying to develop closed economies. I think of mutual aid as necessary harm reduction, not necessarily as a framework for transformative or comprehensive change. It's a way for people to take care of each other, and we deeply need that now and likely always will.
That's great. Thank you so much, Njera. A reminder that at any time during the event, you can type a question into the Google Doc or into the Zoom chat. We're collecting them from the Zoom chat and we'll get back to them. Great. Okay, let's keep moving. A lot of energy for decades has gone into identifying, critiquing, and breaking up power and privilege, decentralizing it. There are good reasons for this, and I don't want to disavow those efforts, but I'm wondering if we have good models for what it looks like to build power, to hold it and grow it in a horizontal way, in a just way. Do the models we've just discussed offer blueprints for building power in communities that haven't had, or perhaps more to the point, are mixed communities trying to heal from misuses of power? Why or why not? What do you think is needed for a more robust practice of building power towards visions of open societies that many of us are working towards? I wonder, Njera, would you kick us off for this question?
Sure. So right now I'm best positioned to speak to 401's model. Our strategy for building, holding, and then diffusing power is to first develop an effective vanguard whose role is to concentrate resources, develop infrastructure, and defend the space for everyday people to engage in revolutionary struggle. After establishing a politically mature and strategically sophisticated collective, our goal is to tactically sever the relationship between systems of oppression and those they marginalize. And these efforts are scaled only to the capacity of the vanguard. This destabilization of the relationship between, first and foremost, the Black masses and capitalist white supremacist institutions creates space for 401 to offer alternatives to those institutions, to those who respond to the disruption by divesting. These alternatives are ultimately democratically owned and controlled by those who populate them, and eliminating wage labor, for example, as a capacity drain, and creating space for healing and capacitation that might also lead to the augmentation of the vanguard. So 401's theory of change differs from that of do-ocracy because it sees its work as unfinished until it is shaped and controlled by those most marginalized in our society. We're not creating a movement where the privileged solve problems because they have the capacity to, but rather one where the privileged develop equity infrastructure that allows those most marginalized to contribute to the solution. And that equity infrastructure includes skill building and resource distribution, and not just like low barrier opportunities to participate. We see mutual aid as something that can contribute long-term to preserving equity within developed anti-capitalist alternatives. So mutual aid within centrally planned economies can make space for communities whose basic needs are already met by a centralized leadership to imagine beyond that reality and work toward one where dreams and not just like human necessities are fulfilled.
This is Raya again. Thank you, Njera. That's great. And while 401 is not a technology project, I think the way that you're talking about and thinking about building infrastructure is so relevant to so many of the tech workers and builders that we have here. So thank you for sharing that with us. We are talking about what are good models that you've seen for building power. Camille, I wonder if you might go next.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the thing that's the model that's been most interesting to me, again, is just to go back to Murray Bookchin and this concept of dual power. But I think that where I feel a lot of efforts go wrong is that I think the focus of dual power, I would say it's two places. It's number one, to siphon off enough people and resources such that you continuously, as Njera's group has done. I saw, you know, some of the work that they did in the past, and it's really wonderful to be sitting here with Njera after that, the occupation and stuff like that, is to continue to precipitate confrontations with the state. And I think critical to that, of course, is self-defense and being able to take gains, take space, hold space continuously. I think that's something that people are uncomfortable with, but it's a requirement. I think the other thing is a concept I heard there's an anarchist scholar called Catherine Malabou. She's a French scholar, and she talked about governable, ungovernable, and non-governable. And I've been over the last year involved with the unschooling movement, and there's something exciting about raising up generations of people who just straight out of the gate think about things differently, that don't see it as I'm in school or not in school or I'm resisting school. It's just like, I'm just doing my thing. So what does it mean to start to, not just from birth, but to start bringing people into spaces? Again, I'm really interested in imaginative spaces, building praxis where people start to think, I'm just doing my own thing, and it's not an escape, it's not Marinage, it's not a maroon village, it's I'm doing my own thing. Of course, again, keeping in mind, how do I hold on to that? Because I think that also draws attention from the state and capital. So I have none of the answers, but I think my project is really in thinking this through and finding pockets where we can start to do things differently to such a point that the standard way of doing things looks absurd. So I think this practice of taking different kinds of shape, embodying different kinds of ways of being together. And I'm not so interested in being a different person alone, being an alternative identity alone. I know that's some people's political project, but I think doing it collectively, being different collectively, and not always just as a resistance practice. And you know, the concept of resistance, again, I think I wrote this down. Njera said something about perpetuation of inequity. And I think there is a dynamic within a lot of resistance work where people are like, it's always going to be bad. And we're always going to be, the boot is going to be upon us. And our work is just to lighten the feeling of the boot print on our face. But this idea that like somebody would put a boot on your face becomes absurd to you and disgusting to you. So I think there's a lot of busy work in terms of this imaginative space where we just, I guess, you know, what did they say? Shift the Overton window or whatever, but start to think things that we've normalized are not normal, not okay. And I think this, right, the pandemic has shined such a light on all of that. And it's interesting, the government goes from, you have to figure these things out to, oh, fine, we'll send it to you in the mail, you know? So what else can you send us in the mail? Can you just get rid of the National Treasury and send that all to us in the mail? What else can we get, you know? So continuing to push that, you know, in radical ways.
This is Raya. That's great, Camille. Thank you. Liz, how do you feel about building power? What models do you turn to?
Right now, all I can think of is what can they send us in the mail? What can we send each other in the mail? Thank you, both of the previous speakers on this. My comment is perhaps more scaled down than what we've just heard. So I hope everyone keeps their mind on what Njera and Camille just shared. And the couple points I'd like to make is how we changed the cultures of tech development inside of our software code communities at Public Lab. Building on the great work of SpinachCon and Hoodie, we restructured, and I specifically want to raise up the work of Jeffrey U. Warren here in transforming our code community to be around welcoming newcomers and the way that code has to be written to welcome newcomers and welcome their cultures in, and scaffolding that first-time experience. So the culture changed so much that many of the typical types of tech contributors that are often stars in the open source world felt like they were displaced out of this culture. And the transformation was reflected in the code itself. So yeah, I look forward. We've been speaking about this in the open source world for a few years now, but I'm pretty excited about what Jeffrey U. Warren is writing up here. And the second and last example about building power is for our plural society. There's a specific leverage point that I'm interested in and why I'm participating in the Computational Democracy Project is sending ever clearer signals amongst ourselves to the powers that be, because there are some instances of binding power. There are ballot referendums where we can directly vote on policy and we can bend the government to the will of the people, but we have to get very clear amongst ourselves. We have to work on how we listen to each other, how we facilitate, how we appropriately use technology to scale deliberation, and meaning that what actually gets onto the ballot that we vote on makes sense, opens up radical space, and helps us take some power back. And I look forward to speaking more about that at some future events. Check.
This is Rhea. Thank you, Liz. I think that point of how can technology be used to scale deliberation is really key and really exciting, and something I'd love to keep thinking about too. I'm going to try to combine my last two questions so that we can move to a Q&A. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for our audience to engage your wonderful minds and articulations here. And this is my way of segueing to them, but I think I can safely venture that our audience today are located in universities, in the tech sector, and within the nonprofit industrial complex, or in the in-between spaces between these. And many of us were perhaps drawn to these sectors in the best case scenario by what they seem to promise in terms of having an impact. But at the same time, I think we're all increasingly aware of how deeply implicated these sectors are, and our work in them has become. So I want to ask you all, how do you address this, or what kinds of advice do you have for people who are, one, navigating like addressing the crisis of scarcity in different places on a regular basis, but two, also trying to keep their eye on that horizon, that bigger political vision, or that larger vision of openness that we've been talking about today. Why do you think it's worthwhile to try and do that balance? And what does it look like for you? And maybe I'm gonna open this up. Who would like to start with an answer to that?
I can go.
Great, Camille.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, I think kind of piggybacking off what I said before, I think shifting that imaginative space is really critical. I think the academics may already know this book, but other people that don't, the Undercommons by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, I think gets you starting to think critically about the institutional space that you are occupying. I think they're doing some actually great work. I think it's the nonprofit journal. Their editor there is a radical Afro-Latina who's doing really good critical work around nonprofits. I don't know, this concept of equity doesn't appeal to me, but I think they're doing some interesting work around that. But I think absurdity, bringing absurdity, there's some great lessons from anarchist praxis in terms of bringing humor, bringing levity, highlighting the absurdity. This concept of work to rule is a powerful tool for building unions. And I do believe in the power of unions. Both of my parents were union members all my life. But I think starting to think about creative ways, not just protest, but other ways. One of the things that got Stefano Harney in so much trouble is he just gave everybody in the class an A. He was like, this doesn't make any sense. He's like, this effort, this project of credentializing onto building the next class of workers, like, I'm not interested and I won't be part of it. So I'm going to do the thing. You said give them grades. Here's all the grades. So what can you do? How can you play with the space you're in? I understand different people have different requirements. I have a job, I understand, but starting to look at it and, you know, hold these things out of relief and look at them and say, what actually makes sense here? What can I back away from? Where can I be creative? Where can I bring levity, fun, play into the space? I definitely try to do that. And also transparency. The people I work with, you know, I manage an extremely large team. And one person, for example, said, oh, I'm going to take off early on Friday. I said, oh, do you work on Friday? You know, like things like that. I was like, what are you working on Friday for? You know, like just little things like that. Where can you play with the space within a space of intimacy, you know, in the space of intimacy? And I'm not going to bring my organization to its knees at the moment, but I think there's creative spaces where that can happen, and little ways that you can kind of chip away. So that's what I would say, thinking creatively about ways to chip away, take resources, take your time back. Where can you take your time back? Because it's so precious. That's it.
That's beautiful, Camille. Thank you. Njera, Liz, how do you manage these kind of pulls between crisis and commitment to a bigger vision, the different places where you're implicated or not?
I could go. Well, a shift we noticed in the public lab community was in how the people coming to our barn raisings, which is our multi-day retreat style in-person gatherings dedicated to environmental research, how they got repurposed for crisis convenings since Hurricane Harvey's flooding and devastation in 2017. So, you know, what we would normally be doing at these multi-day events, there's a combination of facilitation and playfulness that spans the gap between people on the environmental front lines, maybe people already experiencing health impacts. People may already be significantly sick, you know, with quite serious situations, and of course that are built on multiple layers of oppression resulting in why certain groups of people are sick. Meanwhile, we've got hardware developers that maybe are, you know, for them, this is a leisure. For them, this is the fun part of what they get to do, you know, developing environmental sensing tools on the side. And so we at Public Lab had you know, for over like 12 years and counting, we have an event that, yeah, through facilitation and playfulness, spanning this gap, allowing self-organization to take over, spurring durable co-development, co-creation partnerships that could thrive across distance until we got back together again. And I just want to say, you know, as the pace of collapse is speeding up and speeding up unequally, we noticed in the past few years that where we have been focusing on environmental sensing with a concept that we were going for accountability and redress, that we would actually be able to solve problems one at a time. Well, things are speeding up too fast. And especially after Hurricane Harvey, as I mentioned, our next events were shifted in focus to focusing on that relationship building that happened in those facilitated playful spaces and turning that towards community resilience. People said, we can't work on these one at a time, place-based research projects, not right now, not when climate impacts are changing what might come after us. And we know that government is neither preparing us, nor coming to save us, nor planning to rebuild. And so there's an attitude there that I think enabled our community to change focus, but use the same structure. And in the classic line from 80s open space technology that roughly states, the ones who show up are the right people, with the implication that any work that gets done will be done by us or not at all. And I think in that way, public lab is changing and staying relevant to the pace of impact speeding up. Check.
Okay.
Uh-oh, Rhea, are you frozen?
Okay. I think maybe, am I back? Maybe?
You're
Yes.
back. You're
Okay.
back.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Liz. Njera, would you like to respond to this question?
Yeah. So once again, I think Camille was really on point talking about how to be subversive in the space that you're in. It's important to focus on the broader political horizon because it can inform your divestment from institutions that maintain disproportionate and toxic power dynamics and inform your investment in alternatives to those institutions. I think that if you're an academic, ask yourself how your institutional home hoards knowledge, information, and resources. Ask yourself how it validates outdated ideas and how it leverages the power of definition and description against marginalized communities. And then ask yourself how you can move subversively in that space. For example, what would it look like for you to partner with revolutionary organizers for your thesis or dissertation work? What would it look like for you to invite community members to guest lecture? What would it look like for you to make space for those whose justice work is relevant to your subject matter to audit your class? Definitely be prepared to compensate everyone you invite. Also, shameless plug, 401 is super interested in recruiting specifically Black academics to guest lecture at Praxis, a frontistery for Black revolutionaries. Praxis is a 7-year institution that actually exists to further develop Black Vanguard members. And we're interested in how academics are contributing to open data that can be made accessible to marginalized communities while also being kept secure from the state. If you're in the tech industry, are you willing to take a reduction in your salary and apply your skills to the security issues that are crippling social justice movements, especially the movement for Black liberation? Are you willing to help engineer like technological supplements for tactical tools activists use on the ground and in the streets? Can you help activists destabilize tech frameworks that undergird our marginalization or the marginalization of oppressed communities? And what about, I think that Liz mentioned this earlier, developing sustainable technology that helps co-ops like further scale up their work or helps us scale up liberation or liberatory efforts. So our 401's Economic Solidarity Org, CREAM, could benefit from support like this. If you're a nonprofit worker, how are you thinking about moving toward radical philanthropy and worker self-directed models that allow you to disengage from the nonprofit industrial complex? And these are real and pragmatic strategies that people in the nonprofit sector are already taking on. And if you're struggling to build power to do this at your job, seek out ways to join activists, organizers, revolutionaries in other efforts and supplementary efforts. And you can definitely do that with 401, with our Vanguard, with CREAM, with the allyship. Reach out to frontline organizers, frontline revolutionaries, frontline movement workers, and find out how can you support us specifically with the skills that you have. And overall, just please be thinking about how you can shift your investments to align with your values. Where are you giving your time? Where are you giving your energy? Reclaim that shit. where necessary and offer it where real transformation is possible, which is something that I feel like Camille was also saying earlier. So piggybacking.
That's great, Njera. Thank you so much. I think today I'm just feeling like who you surround yourself with also like really affects how you think about where you subvert and where you invert energy and where you subscribe. And it just feels so great to be surrounded with you today. So thanks to the three of you. I would love to move us to the Q&A portion of this event. The public doc has a robust list of questions. Thank you, Moni. And maybe we'll just start going through some of these. Reshma would love to hear more exploration of the relationship between the capacity to do something and privilege. Is that something that the panel feels like they might want to address?
I mean, I can talk about it a little bit and then cede space, but I think particularly in the technology space, it's something we think about a lot. I think there's sometimes this, it's like luxury space communist concept where people are going to seize the Amazon factory and continue to run it, but as a workaround cooperative, and not understanding, you know, that there are a lot of assumptions built into the technology that's there. There's a lot of assumptions built into that tooling. And the idea that we wouldn't just dismantle it and really think about what the needs of the people are is, to me, absurd. It makes a lot of sense to other people, but not to me. And I think one of the things we've thought about carefully, you know, when you think about a do-ocracy, it does have to do so very much with what skills people can bring to the table. So it's two-pronged in my conception. Is not finding a way to start leveling it and saying that the garbage man and the gardener and the farmer and the teacher are all contributors here. And I think we have this weighing of value so much in our capitalist society that it's hard to, you know, reimagine these things. But I think that's something that's critical. And then, of course, Njera talked about this before, but skill sharing. This is something I think that's central to a lot of efforts in building a solidarity economy. I can think of Cooperative Jackson, Cooperation Humboldt, other things like this, where they're also looking at places where they can say, you don't know how to do this today, let me demystify it for you. You know, so I think there's a two-pronged thing. It's number one, not all of us can do everything, and nor should we. And number two, you can do more. And I'm not only a person that holds this knowledge, but I'm a person that wants to share this knowledge, or I'm going to put it in a place where a person who's better at teaching can pick it up and run with it. So I love that Njera brought up like open data, open knowledge, but thinking about how to keep it secure. That's what I'm like really very much chewing on. But I think getting the information out and this hoarding of information that, you know, as I think about, I used to work with a group called Question Copyright, and we looked at a lot of these matters of copyright, patents, and the inability to access things that are in academic journals, you know, that should be shared out, that share good information, that share good research. How can we free these sorts of things, the kind of stuff Aaron Schwartz was trying to do before he passed on? How can we continue to free this information? There's a group, Pirate Care, that I've been associated with, or I know some of the people in this group, and they're doing really cool things with open libraries, with SneakerNet kind of libraries where a huge library gets put on a USB key. So how can we just decentralize this information and get it out to lots more people and build up skills?
Thank you, Camille. Liz.
Yeah, I'm loving what all the panelists are sharing today, especially what Camille just shared. And earlier I had mentioned the kind of the gatekeeping that happens with professionalism and expertism. And I want to say that this is right in the middle of messing up collaborations between people who are coming from different lived experiences and different acquired expertise. It's just, after being part of forming so many different community, academic, institution, partnerships, the thing that is right in the way is people trying to contribute skills and realizing that for them, this is part of their career path. And you're trying to collaborate with someone who this is their life and their life struggle. And we can't not talk about it. And I guess I'm mentioning this point just in case of, who might be the audience watching this and who the network of the people in this audience might be, is just to, I trust there's been a lot of unlearning that's happened. I'm continually trying to unlearn, but I just want to put it right in the middle that wanting to contribute from your skills may be the exact first step, wrong step, versus just showing up and meeting people as people. And then maybe it becomes a nice discovery that folks have different skills to contribute, but then contribute that not in a gatekeeping way, contribute that in a way that there's youth around you, there's learning, things are going slower. It is not going to feel like project management does at work, these kind of collaborations. So I don't know who might have been listening for that, but with my work as a facilitator, most of my interventions around expertism. Thanks.
Liz, I think that's so important. Like when you show up, don't show up from your skill set. I'm definitely gonna be holding on to that. Yeah, we started from the Google Doc, but if folks want to speak their questions, we are in a synchronous space. So I want to give space for that too. If you want to speak a question, feel free to type the word stack into the chat or raise your hand. Njera, I don't want to cut you off if you wanted to respond to that prompt or that question about exploring the capacity to do X and privilege.
I think that the capacity to do anything is a privilege. And I just am going to reiterate that I think there's a responsibility to leverage privilege to carve out space. I think that, again, there has to be a great deal of accountability and investment in discovering how people want to be empowered and how they want to be how they want to contribute, how they want to participate, how they want to drive things forward. And I think that the reality of our material condition now is that a great many people are intentionally and systematically underdeveloped in terms of capacity, so that movements are muffled and are neutralized. And so those who have the privilege of capacity have to be the counterbalance to that. Initially, right? Like the idea is to continue to make movement work accessible, right? And so that's what your capacity is for, in my opinion. That's what that privilege is for.
Brilliant. Thank you, Njera. There are a bunch of questions from Danielle in the doc, and I see her in Stack. I want to give her time for that, but I also want to give voice to Christina and Lane. So Christina is kind of like building off what this conversation that we just started, I think. How do we balance the issue of dominance that Camille referenced when there is a spectrum of capacity that must be utilized if we are to progress Black revolutionary struggle? How can those with the capacity to leverage ensure that it is in service to those who do not? I feel like it's just pushing the last question just a little bit further. Does the panel feel like they can respond to that question?
I mean, I was mentioned, so I'll go
ahead
again. I mean, I think building out proactive practices to kind of body scan for dominance, I think it's so critical rather than being reactive. I think sometimes you do have to build out these reactive practices, and there's a lot of great work people have done around that. But you know, I was part of a formation of women across a lot of different movements, just thinking about what it meant to show up as women in those spaces. and, you know, again, building out praxis. So I think ongoing theme in the work, a lot of the work I do is a temporary kind of holding of space to think through and experiment with praxis, and then sort of devolving back down. But one of the practices that we picked up was from the Kurdish movement, and really sort of adapted to thinking about that daily kind of circle space where you sit down and you say, you know, recommitting to the effort, and also doing a self-assessment, an assessment of yourself, how you showed up in the group. You know, and I actually bring this into my day-to-day professional too. What went well? What could be better? How can we show up better? How can we redouble our commitment to this effort? And I think that internal work needs to be balanced with movement work. And I think if the commitment is to building a space of non-dominance, then you need to be able to do that scan. And then of course, people need to be able to lovingly call you to the floor around how you haven't shown up. These things of course can get ugly, you know, and so I think bringing that softness and making sure that you create spaces for intimacy. And I know with our formation, eating together, meditating together, other sorts of calling in of ancestors together, I think also was really pretty critical to feeling a sense that people mean well when they do this. And then also sometimes having a process, again, like I talked about, for people to transition out, not because they're counter-revolutionary necessarily or anything like that, but that it's not the space for them anymore. And that they're not invited into, you know, they're no longer invited into the circle, and having a process for that. Sometimes people will kick and scream and that's it. But I think that understanding in and out, doing that assessment, holding yourself accountable, and before you go to hold anyone else accountable. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Camille. Njera or Liz, do you have thoughts on this? All right. Oh, go ahead, Njera.
I think in terms of how to ensure that like those who have the capacity are moving in service to those who don't, for me, this is an infrastructural question. So for those who have the capacity, are you carving out a tangible, real space that will be occupied by those who don't have the capacity, right? A space that is equipped with equitable power, right? That is equipped with tools for contribution, that is equipped with education for contribution, et cetera. So I think that it's very important to, on a personal level, on individual levels, and even as a collective, say like, are we exercising too much dominance here? But my focus specifically is making sure that you are actually like prioritizing creating a space that makes that impossible, right? So you should be focused on, if you are someone who is, especially if you are someone who is not directly impacted, creating infrastructure that mirrors what people are asking for, what people are saying is inhibiting their ability to engage, right? It should be that direct a response. And if it isn't a direct response to the material condition that underdevelops folks' capacity and prioritizes those who are most marginalized and multiply marginalized, then I think you're contributing to the problem. This is like a toxic dominance. This is like a toxic leadership and a toxic assertiveness that you're engaging in. And you should take a step back and reevaluate. So short of it is, you should see your intention and efforts to be in collaboration with people and not dominate people reflected in the infrastructure that you've created.
That's great, Njera, thank you very much. And I think we're gonna have to leave it there. And I think that's a great point to leave it on, thinking about how we build our infrastructure as a way of thanking you. I just want to thank you. Could we get a round of applause for our speakers? Thank you so much to the three of you for being here. I'm going to stop the recording.